Welcome to this teaching video for Human Physiology in Ill Health. My name is Jonathan Downham and I have the website criticalcarepractitioner.co.uk. I'm developing a course aimed at nurse practitioners to teach them basic human physiology, so I thought that whilst I was learning it would be a good opportunity to share that learning with others. This then is part of a series of lectures that will expand over time. I hope you find it useful. If you have any comments, please feel free to add them to the comments below. I also have a podcast series which you can find in iTunes. Just go to iTunes, go to the podcast section and type Critical Care Practitioner into the search bar. If you do listen to them, you can subscribe for free, which will ensure you get the latest episodes, and it would be great if you could rate them for me. I hope you enjoy this resource. As I learn, then you learn. So we can talk about homeostatic control and the types of responses and how cells communicate with one another. And we'll start by talking about the local communication between cells. So if you can imagine these cells here, so we've got cell 1 and cell 2 are neighbouring cells, so they're reasonably close. And there's a couple of ways that communication can take place. Cell 1, for example, can secrete a substance which then will act on one of the proteins in the wall of cell 2. So there's going to be a receptor in the wall of cell 2 that the substance that is secreted by cell 1 will act upon on the wall of cell 2 and elicit some kind of response. And this action by one cell acting on another is called a paracrine response. It could also be that cell 2 or cell 1 or any cell really secretes a substance which then comes back and actually acts on cell 2. And this type of reaction where the substance is acting on the cell itself is called an autocrine response. And this is where one neighbouring cell or a cell itself actually acts upon itself, or the neighbouring cell, as I said, acts upon it, secreting these substances. And you can see this kind of response particularly in the GI tract. The next type of communication between local cells is through something called gap junctions. And here you can see here, this is the gap junction. So you've got two neighbouring cells, again you've got cell 1 and cell 2, and substances can pass between these gap junctions in the cell walls, and we'll talk a little bit more about gap junctions at another point. But this can occur particularly with something like calcium. So let's assume that we've got calcium crossing between the cell walls, and calcium is very important in the heart cells. So what happens is that calcium can move very quickly between the cells in the myocardium, which ensures that the muscle will contract as a single sheet, will act as a single sheet rather than contracting at different times. We then have the communication between cells that are remote from one another, so cells that aren't actually next to each other. And we've got two major systems that are going to utilise this an awful lot, and that's the endocrine system and the nervous system. So the endocrine system, so this cell here is an endocrine cell. And you can imagine that what happens is that the endocrine cell, wherever it might be, so be it the thyroid gland or the adrenal glands, is going to secrete a substance here that's going to go into the blood. So it secretes substance which then goes into the blood. And what happens then is that this the blood is then transports the substance and takes it to the target cell. And the target cell has protein receptors on it. So this has protein receptors to whichever substance has been secreted by this cell up here, which then elicits a response. So what happens then? So basically what's happening here is that the endocrine cell from a remote distance is actually regulating activity through secretions. So that's a remote way of one cell actually affecting what another cell does. Now, in the nervous system, this would be, the equivalent would be a neuron. So this here is a neuron. And what's going to happen with the neuron is that it's going to secrete a neurotransmitter. So a neurotransmitter secreted into the synapse, which is the gap between the end of the neuron, if you like, and the effector on the other side. So the effector cell could be, for example, I'll just move this down a little. The effector cell could be one of many things. So the effector cell could be another neuron. It could be a gland. It could be a muscle cell, for example. And the effector cell has receptors. So this has receptors which the neurotransmitter will bind onto. So the neurotransmitter binds onto those receptors, and that as a consequence will cause a change in the activity of the effector cell. So that's how this neuron up here at the top can affect the activity further down. By releasing the neurotransmitter, this crosses the synapse and hits the effector cell, and we'll do a lot more on neurons and synapses, etc., when we talk about the nervous system in particular. Okay, so let's talk about the positive reflex loop again, because it is quite important. So the body receives a stimulus. It becomes too hot or too cold, or CO2 comes too high, or whatever the stimulus is. So that stimulus is then detected by a sensor, in whatever form that might take, and that is along the afferent pathway. That sensor then sends its signal up to the integration center. And in the human body, that is almost always the brain. So in the brain there's a set point. So the brain compares the information it's got with a set point in it to tell it whether the information it's getting, the stimulus, is at that set point or not. So the set point for normal body temperature would be about 37 degrees. The brain will compare it with the set point to decide whether it needs to take an action or not. And if it does, what it then does is it then sends a signal down to the effectors to change something. So they are the elements of the body that will elicit some kind of response which will hopefully reduce something or increase something, and then that actually interferes with the stimulus. The stimulus is then no longer eliciting any more response from the sensors, so that loop is then closed. But as well as positive feedback loops, there are a number of negative feedback loops within the body, and there's both simple and complex. So I'll just run through this diagram just to explain one of the reflex loops that we have. So let's imagine, for example, that we've eaten a good meal which contains glucose. It's one of the things we eat in all the food, and we get a rise in glucose, and the glucose levels consequently rise. And this, therefore, is the stimulus that we're going to get, which is a rise in glucose levels. So what happens then is that this stimulus then acts on the receptors of the beta cells in the pancreas. So this is the beta cell. This is the endocrine cell, so let's call this the beta cell in the pancreas. And this causes this stimulus, i.e. this rising glucose, acts on the sensor, the receptor on the wall of the beta cell, and this then secretes insulin. So it's a hormone secretion. So in the case here, there's going to be a release of insulin from the beta cell, which is going to secrete, and that beta cell then acts on the skeletal muscle. So the target cell here is skeletal muscle, making that skeletal muscle take up the glucose. So the glucose is taken up, so glucose taken up by skeletal muscle. So there's been a stimulus, so the rise in the glucose. This acts on the receptors of the sensory element, which is the beta cell in the pancreas. This then causes the beta cell to secrete the hormone insulin, which acts remotely on the skeletal muscle cells, which causes them to take up more of the glucose, and as a consequence you then get a fall in glucose, which stops this stimulation, which consequently then stops the beta cells secreting more insulin. So you can see that this is a negative feedback loop. Now the process can be slightly more complicated than that, and we can see this particularly with the hypothalamus pituitary response. So if we just work quickly through this diagram here, whereby a stimulus affects cell A, which secretes chemical which works on B and so on down to D. So we've got the stimulus up here, which works on cell A and works its way through the different cells and eventually affects cell D down here. So the example I want to work through is a fall in temperature, for example. And what happens when the stimulus is a fall in temperature is that cell A, which in this example is the hypothalamus, cell A will release a hormone, thyroid releasing hormone. So cell A in this example is the hypothalamus, and this is going to release thyroid releasing hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone. And what that happens is that this thyroid releasing hormone then acts on cell B, which in this case is going to be the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is acted on by the thyroid releasing hormone, and what then happens is that the pituitary gland then releases thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is thyroid stimulating hormone. And this will then act on cell C, and in this case cell C is the thyroid gland. Which will then secrete a thyroid hormone. So the thyroid gland then secretes thyroid hormone, which acts on cell D. And what happens with the thyroid hormone being secreted and acting on cell D? And cell D basically is the cells of the body, and what the thyroid hormone does is causes the cells to increase their metabolic rate. So the metabolic rate goes up, and this causes an increase in heat, so the cells then start to warm up. So that's the feedback from the stimulus right at the top here, which is a drop in temperature working its way all the way through the cells. So there are some positive feedback loops as well that we need to talk about, and one good example is whereby the endocrine cell here stimulates something called follicle stimulating hormone. Or FSH, which acts on this target cell. And what happens, the follicle stimulating hormone actually acts on the target cell, and what it does, it just increases the number of receptors on the target cell on the surface, which then makes that very, very sensitive. So it's now very sensitive. Oh, let me just start that again. Very sensitive. Let's spell it right. So it's very sensitive to FSH. So that's the positive feedback there, that the stimulating hormone increases the number of sensors, which then makes the cell even more sensitive to it. There is another way as well, a slightly more simple route, and an example of this would be in the clotting cascade. So the endocrine cell secretes something which acts on the target cell. The secretion of that on the target cell actually then just increases the production of the response. And I say this happens in the clotting cascade because what happens in the clotting cascade, you get a cascade of proteases which feed back, and that feedback actually activates themselves to create more proteases, which causes a fibrin clot. So that's a positive feedback loop as well. So I want to talk about tonic control as well, and this is where the cell is neither turned on or off, it's kept at a specific level of activity. And this can be seen with the smooth muscle around blood cells that has a basal state of contraction. So you can see here with this blood vessel that it is, this is the lumen of the blood vessel with a set diameter, and this is the basal state where the contraction is maintained at that state. However, if you get increased sympathetic activity, and we'll talk about that when we talk more about the nervous system, this causes the muscle to contract, so the lumen of the vessel is going to become smaller, and this causes vasoconstriction. So with increased input causes it to contract, which causes vasoconstriction. And at the other end of the scale, with a decreased sympathetic activity, this causes relaxation of the smooth muscle, so the lumen of the vessel will become bigger. So with a decreased input, you're going to get a vasodilation. So cardiac and skeletal muscle can do this, and this is known as tonic control. So when we're talking about muscle tone or cardiac tone, this is what we're talking about here. This is tonic control. Sorry, not tonic muscle. This is tonic control. Tonic control. So the final part of this video is going to talk about something called antagonistic control. And this is to do with something called the parasympathetic and the sympathetic response, which is part of the nervous system. So if we talk about the response on the heart, so the heart is beating at 100 beats per minute. And if the heart starts to beat more than 100 beats per minute, what happens then is that the parasympathetic response is that it tries to get it to beat at less than 100 beats per minute. But if the heart then starts to beat at less than 100 beats per minute, the sympathetic system the sympathetic response will try and get it to beat at more than 100 beats per minute. And I know 100 beats per minute is a little bit fast, but that's kind of the ballpark figure we've got there. And so this basically is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic response in opposition to each other to try and keep the heart rate at or around a reasonable level. And if it goes above or below that, then you get a response. These are in opposition to each other. They have different receptors that will respond on the heart to either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic response. And this gives you what is the antagonistic control, which makes sure that the heart rate will stay within reasonable levels. Okay, so we started by talking about local responses between cells. And we mentioned the paracrine and the autocrine responses, and we also talked about the gap junctions. We then moved on to the more regional responses between cells. And that was, we talked specifically about the endocrine cells and the neurons, the endocrine secreting the chemical into the blood, which then gets transported around and acts on the target cell, and then the neurons, which secrete their neurotransmitter. Next was the reflex loops. Whereby there's a stimulus which acts via the afferent pathway on the sensor, goes to the brain, which then elicits a response on the effectors via the efferent pathway. There are negative feedback loops. And there are positive feedback loops. And these can be complex and simple. The complex is whereby we talked about the fall in temperature, which acts on the hypothalamus, then the pituitary, and then finally the thyroid. And the simple was the glucose rising, which acts on the beta cells. The positive feedback loops we talked about was the follicle stimulating hormone and some of the effects on the clotting cascade as well. Then finally we talked about tonic control, which acts, we talked specifically about the blood cells and the circulation and the blood vessels, and the fact that there is a basal state which can be wound up or down by decreased or increased sympathetic activity. So that was tonic control. And then lastly we just talked about antagonistic control. Whereby there's a balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic activity, which decreases or increases the heart rate. So they're just some of the things we talked about in this lecture. So I hope that's useful. This is a series of lectures, so please continue to watch, and like I say, go to my website at www.criticalcarepractitioner.co.uk or find my podcast in iTunes, and like I say, when I learn, you learn.